In 1944, a small farming village in Nazi-occupied Europe was paralyzed by fear, not because of bombs, not because of tanks, but because of one invisible man hiding inside a grain silo. German officers began dying one by one, shot from nowhere, in the middle of a peaceful farm. They searched every house. They arrested villagers. They even brought flamethrowers, but they never imagined the killer was not a soldier. He was a farmer. And before the war was over, this forgotten man would eliminate 28 of the most powerful Nazi officers in the region, using nothing but patience, a rifle, and a place meant to store grain. This is not a movie. This is one of the most terrifying true stories of World War II. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip. The countryside was quiet, too quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that means war is holding its breath. In the spring of 1944, in a small farming village on the edge of Nazi-occupied Europe, a single wheat farmer became something the German army could not defeat. Not with tanks, not with artillery, not with fear. They called him later the ghost in the grain. But before the war, he was just a man who grew food for his family. A farmer before a fighter. His name was Jakob Bauer. He had never fired a rifle in anger, never worn a uniform, never marched beneath any flag. He knew only three things: how to plant seeds, how to harvest crops, and how to protect what was his. When German officers seized his village, they took his grain, his livestock, and finally his brother. Jakob never saw him again. That was the day the farmer disappeared, and the sniper was born. The silo. At the edge of Jakob's farm stood an old grain silo, 40 feet tall, concrete walls, a narrow ladder, a rusted ventilation hatch at the top. To most men, it was a storage building. To Jakob, it was a fortress in the sky. From that hatch, he could see the main road, the German command post, the officers' quarters, every convoy that rolled through his village, and more importantly, they could not see him. The first shot, the first German officer died on a warm afternoon. A major stepped out of a staff car, laughing. Jakob waited. He let the man light his cigarette, let him take a breath, let him forget the war. Then Jakob squeezed the trigger. The officer dropped before the match hit the ground. The Germans thought it was a partisan attack. They never suspected the grain silo. 28 officers, one shadow over the next 3 weeks. Jakob killed 28 German officers, not soldiers, not random patrols. Officers, the brains of the occupation. He studied them like crops. Who arrived, who commanded, who mattered. He fired only when the kill would hurt the most. A colonel inspecting troops, a captain giving orders, a major stepping out of headquarters. One by one they vanished. No sound, no flash, no warning, just death from the sky. German terror. The German command began to unravel. They searched rooftops, they raided houses, they interrogated farmers, but no one ever looked up, because no one imagined that a farmer would turn his own grain silo into a sniper's nest. They called the killer Der Schoenenteufel, the barn devil. Troops refused to walk the road near Jakob's farm. Officers traveled only at night. Fear had entered the ranks of the occupiers, and fear is how empires fall. The final stand. Eventually, the Germans found the silo. They surrounded it with infantry, machine guns, grenades, flamethrowers. Jakob knew it was over, but he didn't climb down. He took one last shot, killing the German commander leading the assault. Then he waited. When the flames reached the top of the silo, the farmer was already gone, slipping out through a hidden ladder into the wheat fields he once planted. The land swallowed him. The war never did. Aftermath. The village was liberated 2 months later. No one ever found Jakob Bauer, but they found 28 graves of German officers and a burned-out grain silo with one small hole in the concrete. right where a rifle barrel once rested, closing the meaning of his war. Jakob Bauer never wore a medal, never gave a speech, never wrote a book. But he proved something the Nazis never understood. You can occupy a nation, but you can never conquer its people. And sometimes the deadliest soldier in a war is not a general, not a tank, not an army, but a quiet man who only wanted to protect his home. Jakob Bauer had spent his entire life with his hands in the soil, not on a rifle. His mornings began before sunrise, when the mist still clung to the wheat like a thin veil and the air smelled of damp earth and growing grain. He knew every inch of his small farm, every crooked fence post, every stubborn rock that refused to be moved. The rhythm of his life was measured in seasons rather than hours. Spring meant planting, summer meant tending, autumn meant harvest, and winter meant waiting. For Jakob, this simple cycle was not just work. It was identity. He was a farmer not because it was what he did, but because it was who he was. The war arrived the way a storm does, distant at first, rumbling somewhere beyond the horizon, until one day it was no longer possible to ignore. German trucks rolled through the village, their engines loud and foreign, crushing the quiet roads Jakob had known since childhood. Soldiers set up checkpoints where children once played, and officers moved into houses that did not belong to them. Jakob watched it all from the edge of his fields, his hands clenched around the wooden handle of his shovel, feeling a growing sense that something deeply wrong was taking root in the same soil he had worked for decades. At first, he tried to keep his head down. He told himself that if he focused on his crops, on keeping his family fed, on staying invisible, the storm might pass. He delivered grain when ordered, gave up chickens when demanded, nodded and stayed silent when soldiers barked commands in a language he barely understood. Each compromise felt like a small cut, not fatal on its own, but painful enough to leave a mark. He was not a hero then. He was just a man trying to survive. That fragile balance shattered the day they took his brother. It happened quickly, brutally, without explanation. One moment they were arguing about the price of seed, the next German soldiers were dragging his brother away, accusing him of helping partisans. Jakob could still hear his voice, angry and scared, calling out his name as he was shoved into the back of a truck. The dust kicked up by the tires hung in the air long after the vehicle disappeared down the road, as if even the land itself was stunned into silence. Days passed, then weeks. There was no word, no trial, no body return, just absence, an empty chair at the table, an untouched pair of boots by the door. Jacob felt something inside him hollow out, as if a part of his own flesh had been cut away. He kept going through the motions of farming, but the rhythm that once steadied him was gone. The fields no longer felt like a place of life. They felt like a place of waiting, and waiting had become unbearable. It was in that emptiness that something changed. The man who had spent his life nurturing growth began to think about how to take something away. He found himself watching the German officers as they moved through the village, their polished boots and crisp uniforms standing out against the dirt and poverty they had brought with them. He noticed how they laughed, how they treated the villagers as if they were nothing more than obstacles or tools. He saw the same indifference in their eyes that he imagined had been there when they took his brother. Jacob had hunted before, not for sport, but for food. He knew how to wait, how to stay still, how to let patience do most of the work. These were skills learned in the fields and forests, not on a battlefield, but they began to take on a different meaning now. He started to think less like a farmer and more like a man who had something to avenge, though he did not yet have a clear plan. Only a growing certainty that doing nothing was no longer an option. The transformation was not sudden. It was slow and painful, like a seed forcing its way through hard ground. Each memory of his brother, each sight of a German officer barking orders, added another layer of resolve. Jakob began to see his farm differently. The familiar shapes of barns and silos, of fences and hedgerows, started to look like possibilities, rather than just parts of his livelihood. What had once been built to store and protect grain could perhaps be used to store and protect something else, something far more dangerous. There was fear, of course. Jacob was not immune to it. He knew what the Germans did to those who resisted. He had seen bodies hanging in nearby towns, had heard stories whispered in the dark about torture and execution. He understood that stepping out of the role of obedient farmer and into the role of fighter meant risking not just his own life, but the safety of anyone connected to him. Yet the fear no longer had the same power it once did. The loss of his brother had created a space inside him where fear used to live, and in that space, something harder and colder had taken root. He began to prepare in small, careful ways. He cleaned his old hunting rifle, checking every part of it as if he were tending a delicate tool. He practiced aiming in the fields, using fence posts and distant trees as targets. These were not the actions of a soldier trained for war, but of a man teaching himself to use what he already had for a new purpose. Each time he pulled the trigger and felt the recoil, he was reminded that this weapon was now an extension of his will. In his mind, he was still a farmer. He still rose early, still walked his fields, still checked on his crops. But beneath that routine, a different identity was growing. The same patience he had used to wait for seeds to sprout was now being used to wait for the right moment. The same attention to detail he had applied to soil and weather was now focused on human patterns, on who went where and when. It was as if the skills of his old life were being reshaped, bent toward a purpose he had never imagined for himself. Jacob did not think of himself as brave. He did not think of himself as a hero. What he felt was something closer to inevitability. The world he had known had been taken from him, and in its place stood something harsh and cruel. To remain only a farmer in such a world felt like a kind of surrender, a quiet acceptance that what had been done to as brother to his village, to his land, was somehow acceptable. That was something he could not live with, so the farmer began to fade, replaced not by a soldier in uniform, but by a man who understood that his home was now a battlefield, even if it still looked like fields and barns. Each step he took away from the life he had known was heavy, but it was also steady, guided by the same stubborn determination that had once kept him planting crops in rocky soil year after year. He did not know how far this path would take him, only that he could no longer turn back. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the world was still and the fields lay dark beneath the sky, Jacob would think of his brother and feel the weight of everything that had been lost. Those thoughts did not make him hesitate. They pushed him forward. The love that had once tied him to a peaceful life now tied him to something far more dangerous. The farmer was still there in his hands and in his habits, but in his heart a fighter had begun to grow, shaped by grief, by anger, and by a deep, unyielding need to make the people who had taken so much from him finally feel what it was like to lose the grain. Silo had stood on Jacob's land longer than he had been alive, a tall, weather-beaten cylinder of concrete that rose above the wheat fields like a silent guardian. It was built for one simple purpose: to store the harvest, to keep the grain dry and safe through long winters, to protect the food that kept families alive. For decades, it had done exactly that, quietly and without drawing attention to itself. Birds nested in its cracks, ivy crept along its base, and children once played hide-and-seek around its shadow. No one ever thought of it as anything more than a part of the farm's background, a piece of scenery as ordinary as the soil itself. When the Germans came, the silo was still just a silo. Soldiers drove past it every day without a second glance, their eyes focused on the road, the checkpoints, and the houses they had turned into offices and barracks. They saw barns as places to search for hidden weapons and farmhouses as places to interrogate frightened villagers. but the silo barely registered in their minds. It was too plain, too familiar, too deeply tied to agriculture to seem like a threat. That invisibility was what made it powerful. Jacob was the first to see it differently. Standing in his fields one evening, watching the German command cars come and go along the main road, he looked up at the silo and realized how much it could see. From its top, the entire village lay open, every movement clear, every vehicle, every figure stepping in and out of headquarters. The silo was not just tall, it was perfectly placed, far enough from the road to remain unnoticed, yet high enough to command a view that no other structure in the area could match. What had been built to hold grain suddenly looked like something that could hold something else entirely. Inside, the silo was a hollow tower, cool and echoing, with a narrow ladder that climbed up its curved wall. Dust motes drifted in the air, catching the light that filtered through small vents near the top. Jacob climbed it slowly the first time, his boots scraping against the metal rungs, his breath loud in the enclosed space. When he reached the hatch and pushed it open just enough to look out, the world spread before him in a way he had never seen from the ground. The fields, the road, the village, even the distant tree line all lay beneath him as if he were standing above a map. The idea took hold in that moment. He could see where the officers walked, where they stopped, where they lingered to talk or smoke. He could see how their cars lined up, how guards were positioned, how little they ever looked up. The silo gave him what no hedge, no ditch, no rooftop could offer: height, distance, and concealment all at once. It was a hunter's dream, but it was built from concrete and steel rather than branches and leaves. Jacob began to modify it in small, careful ways. He widened one of the ventilation slits just enough for a rifle barrel, using tools he already owned, working late at night when the village was quiet. From the outside, nothing changed. The silo still looked old and neglected, just another farm structure weathered by time. From the inside, however, it was slowly becoming something else, something designed not to protect grain but to deliver death. He hauled up a small wooden crate to serve as a seat, positioned so he could remain steady for long periods. He brought blankets to soften the cold of the concrete and to dampen any sound he might make. Even the dust was useful, clinging to him and to the interior, masking any hint that the silo was being used for something other than storage. Everything about the place worked in his favor, and it was all because no one thought to question it. From the outside, German officers saw a farmer's silo. From the inside, Jacob saw a sniper's nest. The thick concrete walls absorbed noise, making his movements and even the crack of a rifle less noticeable. The height meant that shots came from above, an angle few soldiers were trained to look for in a rural village. The open fields around it created long, clear lines of sight, perfect for accurate shooting, and the lack of nearby tall structures meant nothing blocked his view. The silo also gave him time. From up there, he could watch and wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for an entire day, tracking the patterns of the occupiers. He learned when officers were most relaxed, when they felt safest. He learned which cars carried important men, which uniforms belonged to which ranks. All of this knowledge flowed into him through that narrow slit of open sky, turning the silo into both a lookout and a classroom. It was a strange kind of intimacy. From his perch, Jacob could see the expressions on their faces, could tell when they were annoyed, bored, or amused. He cow. LDC the moment when they forgot the war, when they believed themselves untouchable. Those moments were the ones the silo was built to capture, not with cameras, but with a rifle. The Germans never thought to suspect the silo because it fit too neatly into their understanding of the world. Farmers used silos. Farmers were harmless. The building was just part of the agricultural landscape they had come to dominate. That blind spot was as solid as the concrete walls themselves, and Jacob used it to hide in plain sight. Even the logistics favored him. He could move in and out of the silo at dawn and dusk, times when farmers normally worked, blending into the rhythms of rural life. A man walking toward a silo with a sack over his shoulder drew no attention. No one stopped him to check what was inside. To the occupiers, he was just another peasant tending to his crops, and the silo was just another place to store them. As the weeks went by, the silo became more than a structure. It became a symbol of how ordinary things could be turned against those who tried to control them. Every bolt, every rung of the ladder, every patch of rust played a role in what Jacob was doing. The very things that made it old and neglected made it perfect for his purpose. It did not gleam or stand out. It did not suggest power or danger. It suggested only work and weather and time. From within its curved walls, Jacob could feel the vibration of trucks passing on the road below, could hear muffled voices and the distant clatter of boots. The silo connected him to the world he was fighting against, while still keeping him hidden from it. It was both shield and spear, a place of safety and a place of killing. The irony was not lost on him. A building meant to preserve life, to keep food from spoiling, was now being used to end lives. The grain that once filled it had fed families. Now it was empty, hollowed out, waiting for something else to occupy it. Jacob sometimes thought about that as he sat inside, rifle resting against the concrete, the smell of old wheat still faint in the air. Every time he climbed the ladder, he felt as if he were stepping into a different world, one where he was no longer just a farmer but a watcher above the fields, a presence the Germans could not see or understand. The silo gave him a kind of power he had never known before, not because it was a weapon itself, but because it made his own actions more deadly, more precise, more untouchable. In that towering cylinder of concrete, the line between farm and battlefield blurred. The fields still waved in the wind, the village still went about its daily life. But above it all, in the quiet darkness of the silo, a new purpose had taken root, growing just as surely as any crop Jacob had ever planted. Fear did not arrive in the German ranks all at once. It crept in slowly, like a cold draft through a cracked window, barely noticeable at first, easy to dismiss. The first officer's death was explained. DOA as a partisan ambush. The kind of thing that happened in occupied territories. There were reports to file, security procedures to review, but no real panic. The village was quiet, the road seemed under control, and the local farmers were, in their eyes, harmless. One dead man did not mean much to an army used to counting losses in the thousands. Then a second officer was killed, and then a third. Each time it happened in the same area, always near the village, always without warning. No gunfire was heard, no attackers were seen. Men simply fell, sometimes while speaking, sometimes while walking, sometimes while standing in the open, as if nothing in the world could touch them. That was when the unease began to grow, not because of the deaths themselves, but because of the way they happened. There was no pattern they could recognize, no enemy they could point to. The uncertainty was worse than any clear threat. Soldiers could fight partisans hiding in the woods. They could storm buildings, search houses, and patrol roads. But how did you fight something that did not show itself at all? The officers began to feel watched, even when they were alone. Conversations grew shorter, laughter rarer. Men started to glance over their shoulders for no clear reason, as if expecting something to come for them from nowhere. Rumors spread quickly. Some said it was a sniper, others said it was an entire resistance cell. A few whispered about a ghost, something unnatural, stalking the occupiers. In a place where no one could explain what was happening, imagination filled the gaps. Every unexplained sound, every sudden movement became a possible sign of danger. The village that had once felt safely under control now felt hostile, even though nothing about it had visibly changed. The German command tried to restore order through force. Patrols were doubled. Guards were posted at every corner. Raids were carried out in the middle of the night, dragging frightened farmers and shopkeepers from their beds for questioning. But none of it made the killing stop. In fact, the more they searched, the more it seemed as though the enemy was slipping through their fingers, always one step ahead. The officers were the ones who felt it most. They were the targets, even if they did not yet fully understand that. Each time one of them was hit, it sent a shockwave through the hierarchy. Orders had to be rewritten. Meetings were canceled or moved. A single bullet could disrupt an entire day's operations, and that was something no amount of discipline could easily fix. The sense of control that defined their authority was slowly being eaten away. Men began to avoid standing in open areas. They hurried from building to building, keeping close to walls as if concrete could somehow shield them from an invisible threat. Some refused to smoke outside anymore, afraid that the simple act of standing still for too long would make them an easy target. Even inside, they spoke in our voices, glancing at windows and doors as if the danger might somehow slip through them. The psychological weight of it all was crushing. Every officer knew that he might be next, but none of them knew why or when. That kind of fear did not come from explosions or firefights. It came from the waiting, from the constant awareness that death could strike at any moment without warning. It made men jumpy, irritable, and exhausted. They slept poorly, if they slept at all, and when they did, their dreams were filled with sudden, violent ends. What made it even worse was the humiliation. A powerful, occupying force was being terrorized by something they could not identify in a place they believed they had already conquered. It felt like being mocked by the very land they stood on. The idea that a small, unseen enemy could challenge their authority in such a direct way gnawed at their pride as much as it did at their nerves. The village itself became a kind of psychological maze. Every farmer could be a suspect, every barn a hiding place, every field a potential firing line. The Germans no longer saw the villagers as people going about their lives. They saw them as shadows, as possible extensions of the unseen enemy. This suspicion poisoned every interaction, turning even the simplest exchange into a tense, brittle moment. As the killings continued, the atmosphere grew heavier. Some officers began to request transfers, claiming illness or exhaustion. Others drank more, trying to numb the constant edge of fear that followed them everywhere. Discipline suffered, decisions were delayed. Small mistakes became more common, and in war, small mistakes could have large consequences. The unseen sniper had achieved something remarkable. Without ever confronting the German forces directly, he had forced them into a state of permanent anxiety. Their strength lay in organization and confidence, and both were being slowly eroded. They were still armed, still numerous, still in control of the village on paper, but inside, they were losing something far more important, the belief that they were safe. Even when no shots were fired for days, the fear did not fade. It lingered, a constant background noise in their minds. Every quiet moment was filled with the possibility of another death. Every time an officer stepped outside, he wondered if this would be the moment. That anticipation was a weapon in itself, one that required no bullets to keep doing damage. The Germans began to alter their routines, trying to become unpredictable. But that only made things worse, creating confusion and disorder where there had once been structure. The simple act of moving through the village became a source of stress. Paths were changed, schedules shifted, but nothing seemed to offer real protection against an enemy they could not see. In their attempt to hunt the threat, they ended up spreading their own terror. Raids and interrogations made the villagers more fearful and more resentful, widening the gap between occupiers and occupied. That resentment, in turn, fed the very resistance the Germans were trying to crush. The psychological war was being fought on both sides. But the unseen sniper had the advantage of being able to strike and vanish, leaving only doubt and dread behind. It was not the number of men killed that mattered most. It was the way those deaths made every surviving officer question his own fate. Each bullet carried a message far beyond the body it struck, telling everyone who heard about it that no rank, no uniform, no authority could guarantee safety. That message sank deep, unsettling even the most hardened veterans. In a war where firepower and numbers were supposed to decide everything, a single hidden enemy had found a way to make the occupiers feel small and exposed. The fields, the buildings, the quiet village streets, all became part of that psychological trap, turning familiar surroundings into a landscape of invisible threats. The Germans had come to dominate the land, but now the land itself seemed to be working against them, filled with places where death might be waiting, unseen and unstoppable. Jacob never had more than a single rifle, a handful of carefully saved bullets, and the quiet patience he had learned from a lifetime of working the land. Against the machinery of a modern army, it was nothing. The Germans had trucks, radios, heavy weapons, and hundreds of men. They had supply lines that stretched across Ku, entries, and an entire system designed to project power and control. By every conventional measure, Jacob should have been insignificant, a speck that could be crushed without effort. Yet what made him dangerous was not what he had, but how he used it. He understood something the occupiers did not. Power in war was not only about how much force you could bring to bear, but how accurately you could apply it. The German army could shell a village, flatten buildings, and kill indiscriminately, but that kind of destruction did not necessarily weaken their enemies. It often made them stronger, more determined. Jacob, on the other hand, chose his targets with care. He did not fire at the first soldier he saw. He waited for the men whose absence would create the greatest disruption. From his vantage point in the silo, he could observe the hierarchy of the occupiers. He watched who gave orders and who followed them, who arrived in staff cars and who arrived on foot. Over time, the patterns became clear. A particular officer would always be surrounded by others who deferred to him. Another would be the one who organized patrols or handled supplies. These were not just men in uniform, they were nodes in a system, and Jacob aimed for the nodes rather than the countless bodies connected to them. Every shot was the result of long observation. Sometimes he would watch a target for days, learning his habits, noting when he was most exposed. It might be when the officer stepped outside to smoke, or when he crossed a courtyard without thinking, or when he paused to speak to someone. Jacob waited for those moments, not because they were convenient, but because they were telling. They showed when a man felt safe, when he had let his guard down, when he believed himself beyond reach. When Jacob finally pulled the trigger, it was not an act of rage or impulse. It was a calculated decision, guided by a simple question: would this shot matter? Killing a random guard might remove one rifle from the field, but killing a commander could throw an entire unit into confusion. Orders would be delayed, replacements would have to be found, and in the meantime, uncertainty would spread. A single bullet placed in the right body could have an impact far greater than a dozen fired blindly. That was the essence of precision over power. Jacob did not need to match the Germans weapon for weapon. He needed only to strike where it hurt the most. In doing so, he turned their own strength against them. The more structured and hierarchical their system was, the more vulnerable it became to targeted disruption. Remove the right piece and the whole machine stumbled. His approach also conserved his limited resources. Bullets were precious. Each one had to count. He could not afford to waste them on low-value targets or shots taken in haste. The patience he had learned as a farmer served him well here. Just as he would wait for crops to ripen before harvesting, he waited for the perfect moment to fire. Rushing only led to poor results. Waiting brought clarity. The Germans, by contrast, relied on overwhelming force. When they felt threatened, they responded with more troops, more patrols, more displays of power, but this often played into Jacob's hands. More officers on the move meant more opportunities to observe and choose. Their attempts to dominate every space only created more chances for a precise strike to have an outsized effect. Even their defenses were blunt instruments. Checkpoints, searches, and raids created an impression of control, but they did not address the specific threat Jakob posed. They were designed to catch large groups of fighters or hidden weapons, not a single man with a rifle in a clear line of sight. The Germans were swinging a hammer while Jakob was using a scalpel. This difference in approach created a growing imbalance. The occupiers expended enormous energy and resources trying to secure the village, yet a lone sniper continued to shape events with a few well-placed shots. Each death of an officer forced the Germans to divert attention and manpower to investigate, protect, and reorganize. The cost of each bullet Jakob fired was multiplied many times over in their response. There was also a psychological dimension to this precision. Knowing that someone was deliberately targeting key figures made every officer feel exposed. It was not random violence they were facing. It was intentional, focused, and intelligent. That knowledge eroded confidence far more effectively than indiscriminate attacks ever could. It suggested that the enemy understood them, studied them, and knew exactly where to strike. Jakob's method required discipline. There were times when he could have fired when a uniform appeared in his sights, and the urge to pull the trigger was strong. But he held back if the target did not meet his criteria. That restraint was as important as the shots he did take. It ensured that when he acted, the impact was always meaningful. In a way, he was farming death the way he once farmed grain. He planted nothing, but he harvested moments, choosing the ones that would yield the greatest result. Just as a farmer knows that not every plant is worth the same, Jakob knew that not every enemy was equally important. His fields were now the streets and courtyards of the village, and his harvest was measured in disruption rather than bushels. The Germans struggled to understand this because it ran counter to their doctrine. They believed in strength displayed through numbers and firepower. Jakob showed them that strength could also be expressed through restraint and accuracy. A single, carefully aimed shot could achieve what a barrage of artillery could not. It could destabilize an entire command structure. Over time, this approach began to shape the behavior of the occupiers. They became more cautious, more hesitant to gather in groups or to expose their leaders. Meetings were shortened or moved indoors. Movements were restricted. All of these changes slowed their operations, creating friction in a system that depended on efficiency and order. Jakob did not need to win a battle in the traditional sense. He only needed to keep applying pressure in the right places. Each precise strike was a reminder that their power was not absolute, that their control could be challenged by someone who understood where to aim. In a war of massive armies and sweeping fronts, a lone farmer had found a way to make his limited means count by turning every bullet into a lever that could shift something much larger than himself. Loss does not always announce itself with a single clear moment. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, leaving behind small absences that slowly grow heavier until they become impossible to ignore. For Jakob, that loss began with his brother being taken, but it did not end there. It spread into every corner of his life, touching his work, his memories, and the way he saw the world. The farm that had once felt like a place of stability became a landscape filled with reminders of what had been ripped away. Every empty chair, every unfinished conversation, every familiar path his brother no longer walked became part of a silent chorus that followed Jakob wherever he went. Before the occupation, his life had been shaped by connection. Family, neighbors, the shared labor of planting and harvesting, the quiet understanding that everyone depended on one another. That sense of belonging was as real as the soil under his boots. When the Germans arrived, they did not just take resources, they fractured those connections, replacing them with suspicion and fear. The village began to feel smaller, not because its boundaries had changed, but because the trust that once held it together was being eroded. Jacob felt this more acutely than most, because his loss was so personal. His brother was not just a relative, but a constant presence, someone who had shared the weight of work and the warmth of laughter. Without him, every task felt heavier, every success less meaningful. There was a hollowness in Jacob that nothing could fill, and that hollowness demanded something in return. Grief, when it is left to fester, looks for a way out. At first, that way out was anger. It flared whenever Jacob saw a German uniform, whenever he heard the barked orders that had taken his brother away. But anger alone was not enough. It burned hot and fast, leaving behind exhaustion. What sustained him was something deeper, something rooted in the sense that what had been done to his family and his village was wrong in a way that demanded more than quiet endurance. Resistance did not begin for Jacob as a political idea. It was not about ideologies or flags. It was about refusing to accept that the people he loved could be taken and erased without consequence. In that sense, his fight was intensely personal. Every action he took was tied to a memory, a face, a voice that had been silenced. The more he remembered, the stronger his resolve became. The farm itself became a repository of those memories. The fields where he and his brother had worked side by side, the barn where they had shared meals and jokes, the house where their family had gathered, all of it carried the weight of what had been lost. To abandon it, to flee or submit would have felt like abandoning those memories as well. Staying and fighting was a way of honoring them, of asserting that the life he had known still mattered. This kind of resistance was quiet on the surface, but fierce underneath. Jacob did not make speeches or lead rallies. His defiance was expressed through actions, through the decision to take risks that others might not. Each time he climbed into the silo, he carried his grief with him, transforming it into something that could strike back. The pain of loss became a kind of fuel, driving him forward when fear might otherwise have stopped him. There was also a broader sense of injustice that grew alongside his personal grief. As the Germans tightened their grip on the village, Jacob saw the same suffering reflected in the faces of his neighbors. Families lost sons and fathers, homes were searched and sometimes destroyed. People were humiliated and beaten for no reason other than to assert control. Jacob's own pain was mirrored in countless small tragedies around him, and that shared suffering created a silent bond between the villagers. That bond did not always take the form of open cooperation, but it existed nonetheless. A nod here, a look there. Small acts of kindness or quiet warnings passed from one person to another. These were not grand gestures, but they were signs that the occupiers had not broken the spirit of the people. Jacob drew strength from that, knowing that he was not alone in feeling the weight of what had been taken. Resistance born from loss has a particular intensity. It is not easily satisfied or redirected. Jacob was not fighting for abstract victory or recognition. He was fighting to give meaning to what he had endured, to ensure that his brother's disappearance was not just another unrecorded injustice. Each German officer he targeted was, in his mind, a small step toward balancing a set of scales that had been violently tipped out of alignment. This kind of motivation was difficult for the occupiers to understand. They saw resistance as something organized and ideological, something that could be crushed with enough force. They did not grasp how deeply personal it was for people like Jacob. You cannot bomb or arrest grief out of existence. It lives on, adapting and finding new ways to express itself. Jacob's actions were shaped by that emotional core. He was careful, not because he was cold or detached, but because he knew what was at stake. He did not want to create more loss for the people he cared about. His choices were guided by a desire to protect what remained of his world, even as he struck at those who had tried to destroy it. In moments of quiet, when he was alone in the fields or sitting in the dark of the silo, the memories of his brother would come back to him in vivid detail. These were not just painful reminders, they were also anchors, tying him to the person he had been before the war. In holding on to them, he was holding on to the reason he was fighting. The occupiers might have seen only a hostile environment, a place where danger lurked in every corner. Jacob saw something else as well, a home worth defending, shaped by years of shared labor and love. That sense of home was not something the Germans could ever fully take away, no matter how many troops they stationed or how many rules they imposed. Resistance in this way became an extension of that love and loyalty. It was a refusal to let loss define the future. Even as he acted with deadly intent, Jacob was driven by a deeply human need to preserve what mattered to him. The fields, the memories, the people who remained, all of it was bound together by the simple idea that some things were worth risking everything for. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.